Good evening. Today is Monday, April 11th, 2022, and this is the 94th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My honored guest tonight is a dear friend of mine from California today, Donald Babadalir. Donald is a former candidate for a local office in California. In 2014, he ran for a city council seat, which was addressing matters such as taxes, districting, water, and also economic development. Moreover, he has sought to show the connections between both local matters and also at the same time broader general, national, and also global affairs. Donald does serve as an advisor to the NEC-SE on political, cultural, and religious affairs. He espouses for us to act locally, but also think globally all the time. And I think that's what our attitude needs to be to understand how really regional issues work. Donald, it's a pleasure to have you here today. Much appreciated being able to come on the show for the first time.
Colonel, thank you. It's a pleasure. I appreciate the invite and looking forward to digging deep on these matters with you.
No, I got to tell you, it's good to have you here because one of the things we truly know is that California is really canary in a coal mine, and it was very important to kind of take your information as to what you're able to extract on what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in California, specifically, especially after the President of the United States POTUS stated that in March of this past year that we're going to be hit by a possible global famine, if not at least in effects on a global famine that is going to be because of what's happening in Ukraine. But we do know that China had started laying their foundation long ago for trying to put themselves in a position that they can have effects on the U.S. And also at the same time, last year, they went ahead and pushed as part of their national security strategy to make sure that they were able to stabilize their food needs. It's not easy to feed billions of people 3 meals a day. So with that said, I know you had some slides you had put together, and I would love to go through them and see what you were able to put together for the audience to see as far as what the connections are.
Sounds good, Sergio. So what I'm going to try to do is basically try to set the scene for your viewers. We're going to address the matter from different viewpoints, and then I'm going to show how all of these matters are interconnected. And basically the goal of this is to show how matters that are affecting local areas and regions of the United States are actually part of a larger global matter that is taking place right now. So with that said, let's jump right into those slides, and we're going to go ahead and next slide, please. So we're going to start with the statistics on foreign-held ag land. And this information actually comes straight from the USDA Farm Service Agency. This is nothing that I've made up. These aren't estimates. These aren't a matter of conjecture. These are actually reported by the USDA, and this information is available online for everybody to view. So I highly encourage people looking this document up. It is roughly about 240 pages and breaks down the ag land that's owned, private land that's owned, public land that's owned, which countries are the predominant purchasers of that land or holders of that land, how much they own, how many acres, so on and so forth. So we'll jump right into the first line over here, which says foreign individuals and entities reported holding an interest in nearly 37.6 million acres of U.S. ag land as of the end of 2020. This is 2.9% of all privately held ag land and 1.7% of all land in the United States. So people will look at that number and think, okay, well, that's not too much. So let's get a little bit further deeper into this. As of the end of 2020, China held 352,140 acres. Again, that's slightly less than 1% of foreign held acres, but we can drill down a little bit deeper. The most significant acreage increases between 2010 and 2020 were in forest land, cropland, and pasture. And that starts to tell us what's going on over here. The CCP and other countries as well are essentially looking to get into purchasing this private land so that they can use it for agricultural purposes. And therefore, they can profit in terms of industry, but they can also secure their food supply. Going back to the slide. Now, of the 99 million acres of land in California, privately held acreage is roughly about 40% of that. Now, China had 82 investors and 266 parcels. And the value of that was a very, very significant amount. I've included Iran and the Russian Federation here just for your viewers' information. It's a lot smaller when compared to China, but they're all part of the SCO, and that connection there is very crucial for people to understand. These three countries have essentially created what is the anti-NATO, and it's important to follow the patterns here. Next slide.
If I may, before you go to the next slide,
Sure.
it is a key piece that needs to be understood. For our viewers that are watching, in 1992, there was something, 11 days, kind of a conflict that took place between the federal government and private American citizens, Ruby Ridge, where Americans suffered casualties. We come to find out after the conflict in Ruby Ridge that there was a Chinese conglomerate that was the key principle in holding federal land in Ruby Ridge, which was actually the area that was being fought over between the private American citizens who believed that they had the right for that land, and also the federal government that actually took armed action against the citizens, American private citizens in Ruby Ridge. So for those who might say, well, slide information is great, we understand it, China's buying up a lot of property, what does that mean? It sometimes translates to the fact that federal government gets in conflict with Americans on the ground who are not aware of the fact that you have a Chinese conglomerate through Chinese Communist Party that has a want to lease that land, which may cause the issues that you're dealing with on the ground when dealing with federal authorities. So this was very important for our audience to know before we continue with the slide presentations.
Thank you, Sargis. That's a very good point. And another thing I'd like the viewers to know, this information that's been posted by the USDA, this is referring to land that's openly held by individual actors or corporations that are considered, quote unquote, Chinese. However, what it's not telling us is if there are Chinese nationals or agents of the CCP who have happened to attain, let's say, for example, Canadian citizenship. And so they're on paper acting as Canadian citizens and they happen to own land. Well, that's going to get reported as Canadian held land. And make no mistake, I didn't include the information here, but Canada is one of the largest foreign holding actors that there is as far as land is concerned. Now, among those quote unquote Canadians, we don't know what percentage of those are Chinese actors, but it's very possible that there are many actors amongst them that report to the CCP and are part of the overall agenda of what the CCP is trying to achieve. So with that said, I've basically painted a picture of ag land and how it's being held here in the United States. I want to drill down a little bit deeper and talk about the state of California, because as you mentioned earlier, it is the canary in the coal mine. As they say, however California goes, so goes the rest of the United States. And we've seen a lot of policies that have taken shape and been implemented here in California, being slowly rolled out in other states. Colorado has implemented some of those changes. New York, I mean, some people used to think New York was the most progressive of states, and California has, blown that out by a wide margin in some cases. So let's look at California here. For the last 3 decades, it's been solidly under the control of the Democrat Party. We've had a Republican governor here since then, but that really hasn't amounted to much when most of the policies that particular governor, I'm referring to Schwarzenegger, that he espoused were very progressive. And in many cases, he had a lot of agreements with the Democrat Party. What was interesting was in June 2010, California approved the top 2 primary system. And what this system does is it applies to state officers, so state legislators and a governor, but it also applies to members of U.S. Congress. So anyone who is representing the state of California on the federal level. This initiative basically makes it where in the primary elections, usually they take place in June here in California. In the primaries, you'll have, let's say, 5 or 6 different people running for a particular seat. Only the top 2 vote getters of that election will advance to the general election in November. Now, that sounds fine and dandy. Other states do something similar. But what's interesting about this is that this was actually backed by then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and Charlie Munger Jr. Now, let's take a look at who Charlie Munger Jr. is. He's a physicist based out in Palo Alto. He's the son of Berkshire Hathaway Vice Chairman Charlie Munger. Now, the elder, Charlie Munger Sr., he's a billionaire investor, and he's considered the right hand and partner of Warren Buffett. So here, I'd like to shift to the CNBC interview of Senior and his thoughts on the CCP. So if you'd be so kind as to play that for us.
We have some problems, Donald, with the play, but if you could recap for us what the discussion is.
Okay, that's no problem. I'll just paraphrase roughly what Munger Sr. was saying in that interview. This occurred roughly about 9 or 10 months ago, and this interview of the 2 gentlemen that I just mentioned was on CNBC, and a question was brought up about Jack Ma and how the CCP had responded to him, and how he was basically missing in action as of recent. And Munger actually praised the CCP's reaction to Jack Ma. Now, for the viewers, Jack Ma is a CCP actor, but what was interesting was Munger Sr.'s reaction to what the CCP did, which was basically shutting him up. He praised what they did and stated that free speech is not really what's important. It's to control actors like that. Now, he goes on and says that speculation and those sorts of behaviors in a market should be regulated. And some people will agree with that and some people won't. But what was interesting was that he really highly praises the CCP. And if this was just one interview where he was praising the CCP on this matter, people would think, okay, well, it was related really just to speculation and nothing else. But he's had a long, recurring, positive view on the CCP and their efforts and the kind of structure that they have, the state capitalist system that they run there, which is really, it's communism. I mean, they are the Chinese Communist Party. So I thought that was interesting because this is a man that calls himself a capitalist, and his son is also a prominent member of the CAGOP. He has backed, for example, this top 2 tier system. He's been very much involved in state affairs here. And it's interesting that a Republican would support that measure, considering that the state has been firmly in the hands of Democrats for the last 3 decades. And really, what that prop, essentially what it did was guarantee that the future of California would be held by a Democrat supermajority for the foreseeable future. Because typically what you have are, 3 or 4 people running. The top 2 vote getters will end up being Democrats, and we're essentially forced to choose between 2 different Democrats who essentially are saying the same thing. So we're either taking the middle lane at 65 miles per hour toward Armageddon, or we're taking the fast lane at 85 miles per hour toward Armageddon. It makes no difference. We're going to get there anyway. So that is the state of California right now.
So basically what you're saying is that the state of California has created with this system pretty much a uniparty. In this case, a uniparty in California is a Democratic Party, but actually the funding of it is done through what might be possible ties to the Chinese Communist Party conglomerates and even the Chinese Communist Party influencers within the major funding arms of the California GOP. So as long as they're all profiting from it, they'll be content to keep the current formula going, I guess. The Democrat in charge on the political level, as long as the money is flowing. At the lower level, we had this issue when we were looking at even Menlo Park, and these are our defense contractors to an extent. And the fact that we've had individuals at NEC-SE has represented in the past that have sat down with individuals that from those defense contractors have said that show us on the first slide how you're going to make money for the Chinese, and then we can progress as far as talking about other options that we may have on these issues that are strategic matter, not just strategic, but sometimes geostrategic matters when it comes to American national defense. It seems like nothing has changed in California. It's unfortunate. And I think what you're highlighting with basically open source information, there's a reality of what you're dealing with, to include even when we had in the past shows talked about TSMC being an American company, but really at the heart, you have leadership that is tied back to the Chinese Communist Party through the Green Gang. You may not have that blood relationship with these other American companies that exist out there, but they all definitely have been drinking the Kool-Aid as far as making sure that China is taken care of in order to make sure that what they believe is their bottom line pocketbooks are, taken care of as far as their position of power is concerned. I just, the one thing though, Donald, China's having a lot of issues at the global level. They're having issues demographically. They're having problems really just trying to manage all the places that they've actually touched and are actually ruined. Do you see any changes that are going to be affecting the California politics, given the current position that China is in, especially with what's happening with the war in Ukraine and the Russia possible demise as far as the SCO is concerned?
Absolutely. I think right now the CCP feels like they have their backs against the wall. And we'll see as we get further into this presentation. I think the viewers are going to start to develop a bigger mental picture of exactly what's going on. Let me drill down a little bit further, and I think it's going to start to really make sense what's going on here. I've talked about land holdings, and you mentioned TSMC, and on previous shows on New Paradigms, you've done an excellent job, yourself and your guests, Al Johnson, for example, and Michael Yan, and you've had others, and you've spoken about the connections in terms of the chip industry, what's going on with the Confucius Institute, so on and so forth. And really what I'm more focusing on in this presentation, we can talk about all of those, but this is affecting one of our largest industries, which is the food industry, our food supply, and also our water. So what's interesting about California is that 2020 was the first year since 1900. So roughly about 120 years of constant population growth. And in 2020, we had a net decrease in the population of California. Now, it wasn't a huge amount, but it was still significant enough for people to notice. And it was businesses and corporations and individuals who were leaving to quote unquote free states. We had Tesla leave. We had, I think HP has relocated to other locations. We've had smaller corporations leave, but they do employ a lot of individuals. And they've moved to places like Tennessee, Texas, Florida, where they can take advantage of, no state income taxes or minimal taxes, so on and so forth. And now, after that happened, the state housing officials announced just this year that California needs to build an additional 2.5 million homes by the end of the decade to address the housing shortage. And of those, 1 million of those need to be affordable to low-income housing. So let's go to the next slide, and you're really going to start to see how this makes absolutely no sense. And this goes into water now. Despite all of the snowpacks that we've had, now the snowpacks, we have the Sierra Nevadas to our east, which we share on the border with Nevada. And every year we get tons of snowfall, and that eventually translates to rain for the state of California. And what the State Water Resources Control Board and the state itself has been doing, or these bureaucrats have been doing with no pushback from either Newsom or our previous governor, Brown, is they mandate that water drains out to the Pacific, and they say it's for the purpose of saving the fish. By the way, to date, no fish have been saved as a result of this. We have not seen any of their populations recover. So really what we're seeing is a drought that's man-made in the state of California. Now, how could we allow that to happen? But we're also saying that we need to build more housing in the state of California to accommodate for however many people are going to live in 2.5 million homes. From day to day, it could be anywhere from 150,000 people to 500,000 people's worth of water going into the ocean. And anybody who doesn't believe that, you're welcome to go to the ca.gov's Department of Water Resources page, and you can see the outflow data. All of that water is going out into the Delta and into the Pacific Ocean. We also had a water bond that was passed several years ago. And despite that funding being specifically for the purpose of water storage, we've had no new dams built in this state. They haven't even bothered really to improve the existing infrastructure. A couple of years ago, there was a dam further up north in California, Oroville Dam. They were worried that thing was going to collapse when we were having heavy rains. And it could have spelled disaster for the people who were living in the Oroville area just north of Sacramento. And fortunately, nothing like that happened. It was a similar scenario actually to that of the Three Gorges Dam in China. But they have not bothered to improve the existing infrastructure or build new infrastructure. So, and then the really interesting thing was, as of today, this presentation, Governor Newsom has refused to give up his COVID emergency powers. So what people are wondering now is, like, how does that relate to water? Well, water rationing was one of the things that he was demanding as part of his executive powers. So that's still occurring. So the question that our viewers should be asking is, how does a state seek to build that many new homes when we don't have the water, the infrastructure necessary to sustain it? Who on earth would do something like that? Let's go to the next slide.
Well, somebody who's laundering money would do that. The best way, for a lot of people don't know, is if you want to launder money or hide money, is to do it through the process of building real estate, not infrastructure, like you were saying, that actually improves the area. And part of the reason why you're going to drought out, create a man-made drought in California is because if you're trying to push the farmers out and be able to have the Chinese conglomerates come in and take over, the best way to do is make sure you dry them out and then be able to sell that land cheap. So that's the way it works. A lot of people may not know, and the people who are actually getting pensions paid both in Illinois for the work they have done with the police department and the fire department, teachers union especially. You need to listen to this in California. What China
Yep,
does,
all the pension funds.
they've built all these major cities that nobody lives in, and they build these pension funds nobody lives in. They've taken money from the American pensions and tied them into those bills for those infrastructures in China. The issue is, you say, why are you building a city in China that nobody's living in? Because that's how they're basically hiding the pension dollars as far as the money is concerned, what the profit margin is. Now, when they build them, they say that these houses are worth $500,000 to $1 million. Well, that means that your pension portfolio goes up. If you're in the teachers union, if you're the fire department or police or any of these unions out there, you go, well, you know what, we're going to vote for the current, one party rule in California because our pensions are going up, our numbers are going up, but that's on paper. What they've done is they've tied it into Chinese infrastructure built in China. Nobody can take them. Now in the future, if the global economy suffers, and let's say now those houses have to be settled into, well, if a Chinaman decides, well, I'm going to finally, China opens it up and says anybody can come and live in these apartments or these houses that we have built that are worth this much, that house value, when it's valued, actually is going to be less than what it was. Now, you as a pensioner is going to lose everything you had as far as your pension is concerned. You could turn around and complain, but the Chinese can say, well, you know what? Property just changed, flipped, and the price of what it was initially built for is no longer that price. So you can't even hold China liable for what it did, would basically clean out your pensions and destroy your economy. And I think this is one of the problems that we've dealt with when we've been talking about how these politicians have been so overwhelmingly tied to the Chinese Communist Party and these conglomerates that they can't wean themselves off. And that goes across the board, folks. It's Democrat and Republican. They've all bought into the plan. Is put them in a position where basically they cannot counter. And if you're a politician who does counter against anything that the CCP has, they basically will funnel money to the tune of millions over what you can raise and have somebody run against you. I know, as an example, I'll use it. Senator Ron Johnson is in Wisconsin. His opponent is getting a lot of money now. Why? Because Senator Johnson has looked into some of these issues in the eaches, and when they don't like it, they'll go after you. And unfortunately, even the Republicans may keep their mouths shut and not support. And definitely the Democrats will try to knock them out because one more seat for the Democrats is better as far as they're concerned, but nobody's paying attention to how China is really manipulating and playing the game, using us as a chess pieces, or in this case, I would even say checker pieces, to move their strategic policy and their 100-year plan as they had published it, going back 75 years ago now. And that's pretty much it. So I don't want to take away from your briefing, but I think it was important to kind of emphasize.
I'm glad, because what I'm doing is I'm sharing the facts. What you're doing is basically connecting it to the events that are occurring, and in a very practical and understandable way. And that's what we're trying to do here, is make sense of these, what seem to be unrelated facts. We're making a connection between them. So thank you for doing that. And another thing you touched on, and I just want to echo it, is some people think that if we get Republicans in office, just any Republicans, that things are going to automatically change. Look, you don't need to go back to that first slide, but if we just look at what happened here in California, those were Republicans that pushed the top two system here in the state of California. On paper, Governor Schwarzenegger was a Republican. On paper, Charlie Munger Jr. is a Republican. And yet they made a decision that to anybody from the outside looking in would look like possibly one of the most strategic blunders that anybody could ever make. You essentially handed the Democrat Party, the state of California, to them on a silver platter. And again, folks, it makes no difference whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. It's just that the Democrats happen to, here in this state, happen to be better buddies with them. But they both cut deals with them. They both enjoy the same benefits that they can get from them, whether it's lucrative book deals or future job security in some industry, whatever it may be. What we need, regardless of party, are America First candidates. And with that said, let's go ahead and shift to current and attempted foreign holdings by the Chinese. Now, this list is not exhaustive. These are just three that happen to stand out from the last decade. In 2013, the WH Group of China purchased Smithfield Foods for $4.7 billion. That was interesting because that, number one, Smithfield Foods was an American company, I think based out of West Virginia. That's a huge deal. And they make all of those packaged bacon products, so on and so forth, that a lot of Americans use. So we move on to the next one. This one was an attempt, did not go through, but it was a major one with a very, very big player who has since passed away, former Senator and Majority Leader Harry Reid. His eldest son happened to be with one of the largest law firms in Nevada. Together, the two of them were involved in an effort to, with the ENN Energy Group, to build a $5 billion solar farm and panel manufacturing plant in Clark County in Nevada. That this is like outside of Las Vegas, for those of you who are wondering where. Reid was attempting to pressure Nevada's largest power company, NV Energy, to sign up as their first customer. And ENN ended up backing out of that deal in July 2013. It was because they couldn't secure enough of those contracts with the power companies as their customers in order to make this deal go through. But this is what we're looking at as Americans. We're looking at our politicians literally selling U.S. land for pennies on the dollar to our strategic competitors and opponents for pennies on the dollar just so they can have their political gain. Look, Harry Reid, when he was alive, he was considered untouchable until whatever happened. Then he ended up getting a black eye. I don't know if you folks remember when that happened, but look, these people will sell. They will sweep the rug out from under your feet. They will sell the land that you live on to our enemies for their own political gain. This is what we need to end here in this country.
Well, look, I don't know if you're going to end it, but the reality is, as I mentioned, Ruby Ridge. Ruby Ridge is a major, piece that people can look at and see where the Chinese conglomerates were tied to that particular piece of property that eventually our federal guys went down and had a face-to-face issue with the private American citizens, and American citizens ended up losing their life in the process. So that's very key and important. And we hope that the reality wasn't that there was a Chinese conglomerate that was really on behind why, the federal law enforcement systems were used by our politicians so aggressively in that particular meeting engagement. And again, we go back to the same thing as talked about. China, even here in Illinois, is doing a lot of purchase of agricultural land. In Wisconsin, they're really targeting it. The amount of food right now that they're pulling out of the United States is absolutely enormous. I have numbers of metric tons of what's been asked and required. Even in the most current times, you're looking at almost 9 million metric tons of just sugar being pulled out. You're talking about wheat, corn that is going to China, to include flour, 175,000 metric tons as of even today. And this stuff is being pulled by China from the United States, where usually you used to have 340 shipping containers are up. Their wants and desire to send the 50 shipping containers. And, when you're looking at almost 340 $50 per metric ton. That's a lot of money, and these politicians know that they can make money in that process. So they do have stock that are tied to these. And what the Chinese are trying to do right now, in my opinion, is basically they're going to try to stabilize the price of meats that have been skyrocketing. Some were just before September and October duration before the election of 2022, and then they're going to suddenly hammer us with a increase in the price. So the way they'll do it, instead of having us ship it from here to buyer or sellers here to the United States with some of the food companies you mentioned, they'll ask them if you can ship it directly from South America out to China without having to bring it through the U.S. to include fertilizer or anything else in that capacity. They'll do that, stabilize it, and then they'll hammer the next, if there's a way where Republicans can come in 2022 and make sure that the Republicans that come in cannot deal with the issues at hand all the way through the next election to ensure that they can use that to target the 2024 elections. And one of the reasons I was asked, Colonel Sangari, you get a pretty good run, when you ran last time, why aren't you running now, which is much better for Republicans to run? I said, because I know that China's setting up the stage for almost every Republican to fail. And we're not talking about the Republicans in name only or rhinos that you all have in California, some of which you mentioned. We're talking about individuals that might be, pro-America, but China will use its influence internally to how it can manipulate the price of our foods to make sure that the next president of the United States may not be a America First president, to make sure that he's under so much pressure that possibly the next Republican House and Senate are under so much of a pressure that they will not be able to recover from the damages that China has already caused currently. And if you remember in 2020, January, I had just come back.
They did the same exact thing.
Yeah, they did the same exact thing, which is the reason why I had just come back from Korea at that time. We knew something was coming out of China. Did a interview with Michael Yon, you mentioned him earlier, and stated in that interview, Michael Yon was very much key on the points that there's going to be a global pandemic, when nobody was talking about a global pandemic in January of 2020. Is going to be followed by a major war, which we have in Ukraine and Russia now, and that would be followed by a major famine, which we know we can see the results of it now, even in Africa, where I was looking at in just this past year, where we may have food shortages here. You're going to have biblical famines across Africa and all the areas that China needs to destabilize to ensure they can move in using taxpayer money to claim those areas for its long-term future benefit. And the stock companies that so much the folks on the other end of the aisle are pushing for, that are really to profit, Chinese Communist Party, conglomerates. I know I kind of went through again a larger number of the costs, looking at the metric tonnage that is out there that they're asking for, but I think that kind of sets everything in play for our audience to understand why you're giving the presentation you are, and how California is really the breach point for the Chinese Communist Party into the United States.
Yeah, and you had mentioned, Sargis, that excellent points. You had mentioned January 2020. What was really interesting was the Chinese had their delegation come to DC in January. They literally shook hands with our people in DC. They shook Vice President Pence's hand, all of our individuals involved with that trade deal that President Trump was trying to make go through at that time. And they knew what was going on in China at that time, in Wuhan. And yet they still came and they shook hands with our leaders at that time. So my question is with them knowing that they were literally allowing for this virus to spread, and that they could have been potential carriers for it at that time, and they came and they shook hands with our leaders. Yeah, they didn't care. So how is it that somebody like Charlie Munger Sr. can sit in an interview on CNBC and say, oh, well, we need to have better relations with them, and we need to have very good ties with them? No, let's make a correction to that statement. The good, innocent people that live within the country, the borders that are called China, we'd like to have good relations with those individuals, but as far as the criminal enterprise known as the CCP, no. These people that knew what was going on, and whether it was a biolab leak and it was done on purpose or not, I'm not even going to get into that. What I'm saying is that they knew that this was coming out of their country and they did nothing to stop it, because it comes down to the statement of, when there's a good crisis, never let that go to waste. And there have been many people who have said that same statement, and I'll get into that in a second, what that means. But no, you absolutely nailed it, Sargis.
We did. Unfortunately, the legislators didn't do anything about it. And frankly, I don't think they're going to do anything about it under the current Congress. And I don't think they will do anything about it, even, I hate to tell you, if there's a turnaround in the next Congress. Because as we've come to find out over the years, Donald, working the legislative issues at the federal level has kicked the can down to the local level at every level almost, in every state. Mm-hmm. And they're not trying to resolve issues at the federal level. They're trying to say, well, there's going to be legislation has to be done at the local levels, which, okay, makes sense. I got it. The states have to do it. But when you have states that are really held by the Chinese influence, you got issues. Look, even Texas, for God's sakes, you had the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, operating out of embassies, Chinese embassies inside of Texas. And the current governor, who just got reelected, he won his primary against Colonel Allen West. He knew about this, but they were still operating. So there you go.
Yeah. Or what about Dianne Feinstein's driver? What about Dianne Feinstein's driver? Or what about the congressman? What was it, Swalwell? All these individuals had links to the CCP. They were CCP agents operating under our noses. And nothing was done about it.
They were not, but the people who were working for them were CCP agents working in their staff. That's what you're, just for the correction of the record. So, look, everything we're talking about is open source, folks. All we do is we kind of put it all together and give you a reference to go look at. Just because we propose it here on our slide deck doesn't mean you just take it as gospel. Take it, but go follow her up and see exactly, you know, where we may have missed something, but that's where the crux of it is.
You definitely touched on something when you said that about 2020, because it's going to happen again. And what's important, look, a lot of what politics is pattern recognition. Yes. When you're seeking to understand politics, you have to understand how patterns work. And it's not so much as history will repeat. It's that we're seeing patterns repeat. What they did in 2020 was intended basically to get the America First candidates to lose, number one, the America First candidate for president to lose his reelection bid, President Trump. So him not getting his second term was essentially like, you know, heaven for them, because it allowed them to continue operating and buy themselves enough time to make the changes that they're trying to make right now to essentially guarantee their food security going forward into the future. And that's why I want to get into their motives. So that's the next slide, is China's motives.
Let's go to the next slide.
Let's go ahead and get that slide. So China's motives, and Sargis, you're the expert on this. You've mentioned this before, the One Belt, One Road initiative. They have no problem whatsoever investing in foreign nations, ag industries, to improve their own food security. And here's why. Depending on which source you look at and what year it is, China only has anywhere from 5 to 12% arable land. Now, for a nation of, 1.6 or 7 billion individuals, that's a very small amount of land that they can work. And part of it was because they started building so much in the last 80, 90 years, trying to industrialize the nation, that they really paved over a lot of land that they had for use. So that's a big driver for them. Is here's something that people have to understand about the CCP. Their unspoken or unwritten agreement with the people in the country was this: you will not have the same freedoms afforded to individuals, say, for example, in the United States or in the Western classically liberal world. You will not have those freedoms. However, you will have security, protection, a bright economic future. And what we're seeing now is the Chinese Communist Party and their system is essentially cracking under the pressure of what's going on geopolitically. So they're having to scramble to pick up those pieces and patch up those cracks because their population has agreed to this only in so much that they can have a future that's guaranteed. If they start seeing long-term famine and millions and millions of people are dying again, well, they're not going to go along with the program. The next thing is, and you've touched on this as well, is the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So we've got a global fertilizer shortage. Mainstream media has been talking about that as well. I quoted Reuters. And then China banned, you had mentioned last year they banned the exportation of fertilizer in anticipation to a lot of these geopolitical changes that you were talking about. And they did it to protect their own farming sector from the rising prices. And that was, you can find that in India Times. So what's going on is there's a global fertilizer shortage. You've got the crisis going on. And at the same time, they were anticipating that would happen. So they had to shore up their own supplies, which is why they started this back in September, is they banned that export. So they are fully in prep mode right now for what's to come. And really, as an individual looking at these issues, the moment you see these little red flags, you really should be alarmed. And going back to the other things I've mentioned, when you start seeing our own nation's leaders and our processes and our laws weaponized against us, you should be worried. When you start seeing these red flags of countries preparing for global shortages and so on and so forth, you should be concerned. And that's why we need to make changes here domestically in terms of how our political system is working for us, the kind of candidates that we're electing, and we need to get out of this silly paradigm of left and right. Most Americans want the same thing, and our disagreements are almost fully fabricated by the Mockingbird media. And really what our enemies are taking advantage of is what's called the Hegelian dialectic. Really what it is problem, reaction, solution. So I'll give you an example. Going back to the 2020 thing is, there was the outbreak of the coronavirus. And the CCP could have called President Trump and said, hey, there's this situation that's going on over here. Maybe you should close off your country and until we get a better grip of what's going on over here. But what did they do? They let it go on. And they actually came here and shook hands with our leaders. And then they left and they probably smiled on the way home. And what ended up happening was all of the panic that caused here in the United States, which led to the lockdowns, which led to the mask mandates, then the vaccine mandates. And so what they created was this artificial solution. And US politicians were able to take advantage of that domestically because it increased their powers. For example, Governor Newsom. But what it also did is it gave China an opportunity. And what was that opportunity? Well, they could get the sitting president to potentially lose an election by taking advantage of that. And we see that over and over again. Look, and they have another motive in all of this. The same way that we've seen the United States population sort of gravitate more toward quote unquote healthy products, they're having that same issue in China now. They're industrialized. They've industrialized. They're trying to increase the amount of healthy food that their people are taking. So they're looking for fruits and nuts and so on and so forth. And California itself grows half of the U.S.'s fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So this is a prime target for them. And Sargis, one of the things that they do, there are real estate agents here who will essentially find CCP nationals who come here to the United States, And they'll tell them, look, this property is very difficult for a typical American to get. Just so you are all familiar, this may be happening elsewhere in the United States as well, but it's very, very big here in the state of California. Is people are paying anywhere from $20,000 to $80,000 over the asking price for some of these homes. So how is it that the Chinese nationals are able to come by and scoop up these properties? Well, the real estate agent will tell them, look, I've got this individual who's willing to fund you. They'll put the money into your account. You'll take it and you'll do an all cash offer on this property and you'll beat out everybody. And so now what we're seeing is in the Bay Area, we've got so many individuals from China and even in India who have come and have been able to buy a lot of these properties up using cash offers. So with that, I think, Sargis, you wanted to chime in as well?
No, look, I want to go back to your first point first because what you just described is happening. But in that Belt and Road Initiative, it's important for folks to know between the war in Russia and Ukraine, Russia has the largest amount of potash that is there globally. But the one that beats it really, if not the second, is Cuba. Cuba has mountains of it. For almost 100 years, you can have contract with them. Who shows up in Cuba on the Cuban doorsteps is China and signs a Belt and Road Initiative with Cuba in itself. And people say, well, what is the importance of these particular items, fertilizers and potash and oils, and why is it so important that you have more transactions taking place in cash? Because as we have sanctioned, as I've told folks in D.C., Putin, banks, specifically Russian banks, we haven't sanctioned the cash. We cannot sanction cash. You can't go say, I'm going to sanction the U.S. dollar. So that's why, individuals like Russia, China are able to work multiple different scenarios and systems inside of our country to make sure cash transfers take place, that a lot of it is going to end up in the hands of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization signatorial countries like Russia and Iran to begin with anyway. So that they can continue their operations as is, bypassing any type of sanctions that the West may put on the banking systems. And that's one of the things I don't think people are aware of. Everything that the CCP does in the long run is geared for the Chinese Communist Party hold of power, not because they care about their own people. They've burned their people in crematoriums to make sure that nobody knows how bad the initial Wuhan virus issue was internally to Wuhan itself. They have killed oppositions internally. You talk about people who actually, have individuals of a particular faith in China or spiritual philosophy that they hold basically in cages, and they harvest their organs for the highest bidder, and they cut them out live out of the person, rather than in the past you would at least have them put to sleep to make sure that they give the best harvest of the organs to whoever on the global market is bidding for them. So if they're willing to do that to their own people, what do you think they're going to do to you as some schmuck businessman in the U.S. who's prostituting yourself to the Chinese, thinking that, I'm able to make money like everybody else in the China market. You're only making it because it fits the Chinese Communist Party plan. I've said that when I wrote the new power relations model in October of 2015, I wrote the article in the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. The plan that was initially proposed by Wang Yi, which was at that time actualized and not currently supported by the United States, is the same plan. And you can even see it manifesting itself in the proxy war that's taking place in Ukraine specifically, which is why Ukraine is constantly bleeding, but it will never be given everything it needs to be able to outright win a geostrategic fight against Russia. So all these things are tied together. It does affect us on the ground. It affects our farmers here in the United States Midwest, and is affecting everybody in California. And I will tell you, unfortunately, even with a possible complete landslide of a shift, a tsunami of Republicans coming in, I don't think any of those Republicans coming in really do truly understand the implications of how vast the CCP control is within the states that they are trying to win elections in. And I don't know if they're half of them are ready to even counter what China has
Mm-hmm.
already established within the DC circles for them to be able to go against it. And as soon as you win your election, a Republican, Democrat, as soon as you make it to DC and get sworn in, as soon as you're done with being briefed on the farm, what is on the agenda for the next coming Congress by both your Republican, Democratic leaders, they take a flight into China, where China actually puts on stage what are the business capabilities of what China can offer the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And if you buy into it that second, then that's it. You're done. They could buy you just like that, regardless of if you're an American
Yeah.
first, up of a Canada, or Republican, or Democratic side.
And if they're not the ones that are advertising it, you'll have somebody like our very own Munger advertising it for them. Look, they have so much control. One of the things I didn't mention, but it was there on the slides for our viewers, was in 2018, they took over one of our largest ports here in the United States, the Long Beach port. I mean, they use a systems approach to the way that they're trying to attain dominance. A lot of our politicians, unfortunately, and the people who are involved in policy making here, think in a manner that's called linear thinking. Now, linear thinking is great for small tasks, but when you've got large systems interacting and systems within systems, you can't use that as your sole method of your sole approach toward politics. They have everything, every I dotted and every T crossed in their approach. So they've got the supply chain, the food security with them buying up the ag land, all of that. And you look at it and you think, well, why on earth would our politicians do this? What's the explanation for their destructive anti-American behavior? Well, part of it is the money, like you mentioned. But really what a lot of this is they're aiming to use appeals to emotion to control the U.S. population. So they get them to vote for people who are against the country's interests, against the citizens' interest, and they'll do it in a way that a lot of people who have good hearts will fall for it. So here in California, they do it under the guise of saving the forests, saving the fish. So, for example, with the water going out through the delta, the whole plot device that they used there was we're going to save a declining fish population here. When it came to all the fires that we were having, a lot of that was caused by them saying, don't cut down the trees. Well, we used to have forest management here. And the Mockingbird media mocked President Trump when he made a reference to raking the forests. And that's an actual term. Raking the forest means you basically get rid of all of the dry brush and things like that are flammable in a forest, and also getting rid of dead trees, burnt trees, things that are flammable that could cause a large fire like the ones we've had in California for the last 2 or 3 years. So when he made that trip out here and they mocked him about that, that's what we used to do in California. And we had these politicians, these traitors, really end that. And as a result, it has caused all of the fires that we see now, which, again, it creates this process, this Hegelian dialectic. You have a problem, you have a reaction, and then the solution, what is it? Well, Governor Newsom said, well, I get to have emergency powers. And as a result of that, they can do all sorts of things like get federal funding. Remember, he was begging President Trump for funding for the fires, Governor Brown and then Newsom. And then they can ration water. They can do all of those things. And just like you said, it was basically to create a situation where the businesses that operate here and the individuals who have influence here, for them to get so fed up that they leave and go to other states, and the land gets sold for pennies on the dollar to these agents from the CCP or individuals here in the United States who basically bow to them.
Yeah, they do, and I don't think the Chinese Communist Party folks care that you're leaving California. It just makes more space for them, and they'll bring their businesses in anyway in the long run. So, thank you for leaving. I always recommend people instead of leaving, once you stay, fight to make a change. I mean, seriously, it's
Yep.
not that difficult to run for a school board, for God's sakes. And if you're not willing to even run for that, then shut up, stop talking about how the government is corrupt. I mean, you're going to eventually have to say I got a skin in the game on saving my nation. So it's not that difficult to do. Donald, I know we got one more last slide, but after that we're gonna have to end it. Otherwise, we can sit here and talk for hours on the issues that are coming up. I'm glad we were able to at least address it through these slide decks. Let's bring up that last slide.
Yeah. So really, these are just some thoughts and conclusions I'd like people to ponder. In the coming days. Foreign-owned land is not really a shock. There's a lot of countries that own land here, foreign actors that own land here in the United States. Again, you can go back and look at that USDA PDF, and you'll see all the numbers in there. That's not alarming. What's alarming is that we have a 10x increase in Chinese land holdings since 2009. So literally in one decade, we've seen a lot of that land that's being purchased is coming from China, and they've increased it at a very alarming rate. And the other countries that own it, well, a lot of them are strategic partners. I mean, you've had the USMCA, the new agreement that was done under Trump, between Canada, US, and Mexico. Well, some of these countries are strategic partners, so it's kind of inevitable that you'll see that kind of a thing. But when you have China doing it, when they're taking our ports, when they're taking these companies, there's a pattern there, and I think people need to be aware of it, because we're no longer just talking about our chips being produced by our competitors, by our in some cases our enemies. This is our food supply we're talking about here. And remember, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what comes first is food, clothing, and shelter. Computers are a little bit higher up on that hierarchy. So we really need to be diligent in addressing this, because you don't want a famine here in the United States. Sargis, you've alluded to this before. You've had other guests that mentioned it. Michael Jan had mentioned it back when the whole coronavirus thing was starting. When you have a virus, or let's just say plague, you have other things that come with it, like famine, war. And we're seeing all of the markers of that right now, all of the red flags for that. And these things are called the four horsemen of apocalypse, symbolically speaking. So those things we need to look at. If you have one, you're going to run into one of the others, and it creates a cycle of it. We really need to go back to that Trump era policy of ending acquisitions of American companies by Chinese investors and foreign actors. That should be the official U.S. policy, and it should be a bipartisan effort. So what I'm saying is, if you see a U.S. politician advocating for anything other than that, then that person does not care about you or our country. For us as Americans, America has to come first. And for whatever other country, their country should come first. You look at the CCP, for example, their country, or in their case, their party, comes first for them. But here in the United States, it's everybody else before us. And that shouldn't be the case. We don't tolerate the leaking of classified information to foreign powers. At least on paper, we don't. So why are we tolerating the takeover of our nation's most prized assets by foreign powers? Why are we doing that? Look, some of this, you look at these percentages of how much land is being held by these powers. It looks like a small number, but when you look at California, this is considered prime ag land, and there's a very small percentage of prime ag land in the entire world. A lot of it is here in California. So part of it we've either paved over with all of the housing and other junk that we've built, but part of it is actually being used for agricultural purposes. And now when you see this alarming increase, it should be a red flag in the minds of everybody that's looking at this. So that's what I urge our viewers. is take a good look at what your politicians are doing, and we need to reassess who it is that we're voting into office. But you did mention it. Sometimes it doesn't matter because they get into office, even if they meant well at the beginning, and they end up selling out later on once they can see what kind of money can be made. Now, what's the answer to that, Sargis? I don't know. That's something that you can probably touch on, but that's pretty much it.
No, it's education. I think it's education. If you educate them, they can make much better, broader decisions rather than the generic ones that their party leadership tells them to make anyway. Look, I do agree that you go back to that Trump era requirement, but here's a problem you run into. You have an American company, and the company leader is tied to the Green Gang, the Chinese Communist Party historically, and they're the ones who have actually empowered him to be able to create his generational wealth for his and his son and his family. Well, his son attends the U.S. military academy as an American citizen, starts moving up into the ranks of the U.S. military, and then retires as a general officer and as actually running that particular company. He's not going to turn around and dump his father, his generational wealth, because somebody tells them, look, listen, the reason this company was created and your dad created this generational wealth was because it was in support of the Chinese Communist Party, that you have blood relationships through 2 generations removed. Even if you do that right now, we're so far behind the power curve that what Trump was trying to do was trying to at least stabilize the initial impact. I mean, the Chinese are way ahead right now. They got plenty of roots, deep roots in the United States, in all segments of our society, with American citizens that are tied through blood relationship to the current leadership of the historical leadership, I should say, of the Chinese Communist Party and the Green Gang. So how are we going to be able to clean that up? It's going to be somewhat impossible. You can remove the teeth out of
That's
the
why we need
dragon's
you in
mouth.
office, right?
Yeah, if they allow me after this show, forget about it. You know, after this one, they'll probably have their guys on the ground moving fake ballots into the voting boxes. But let's see what happens. Hopefully, what we do as an educational piece for our politicians helps them out, and also the American public to realize what's going on. And if they're able to reach out and touch it and have an effect, we recommend they do so because U.S. is in trouble. The most current recommendations I made to folks in Congress is that you need to purchase 1-for-1 what China is trying to purchase in metric tons for China. And right now we have 0 contracts coming from the U.S. government to our food distributors requesting sales in advance to stop what the POTUS said might be a global famine, which boggles my mind. I mean, for God's sakes, he's a Democrat. Democrats own both the House and the Senate. At least follow what he's telling you. And these are the West execs that actually are in charge of the White House. That were the same West execs that really bought into the plan of Wang Yi in 2012 when it was proposed, and they never offered a counter in 2014, where President Obama was trying to actualize it through Suzhou Rice's speech at Georgetown University. I recommend people go and watch it. Donald, it was a pleasure having you here.
Decline.
Yeah, that's what Paul Ryan called it, a manager decline at that time. But it was a pleasure having you here. I know, like I said, we could talk hours. We're already past the hour mark on this discussion. But for our viewers out there, if you like the type of programming we do, please help us out. This year we're raising money in United Assyrian Appeal again for Assyrians in northern Iraq. They're going to get hit hard based on what is happening in Ukraine with the famine that's going to affect them. And at the same time, South Sudan, unfortunately, you had soldiers and fighting between the President Kiir's soldiers, president of South Sudan currently, and his first vice president in the State of Union inside of South Sudan recently, or the Upper Nile area as of Saturday, and that's going to get worse. World Food Program has already pulled out, trying to address Afghanistan. They're not just structured to come back and be able to fix our issues in East Africa. We're about to see a destabilization of East Africa because of what the Chinese are pushing. Keep in mind, the Wagner Group, which is a Russian-led organization, it's within African nations already, and every single African nation that has Wagner Group operating in it did not vote against the Russians for the invasion of Ukraine during the UN vote. So we have a few places that we can have victory. Let's try to do something to at least stabilize American footprint in the long run, because I know China's trying to get in there in order to get into the old Belgium Congo, and with the materials that are there, you can buy the entire state of Israel, as I've had said before. Also, I want to thank Sim Production for the type of work they do. They've been a mainstay for us, and are the reason why we're able to have these wonderful programs, to be able to even bring Donald today on the phone. Hopefully next time we'll have him in the flesh. But Donald, you get the last word before we depart.
Yeah, thank you, Sargis, for having me. I definitely appreciate you and all everything your show touches on. So hopefully we'll do this again. And again, thanks for everything.
Thank you for being here. God bless everybody, and there's new paradigms.